All right, our next session this afternoon is looking at future housing models. So we're shifting out of the adaptation space and into really interesting housing models that are pushing the limits of, again, our kind of legislative edges, but also looking at how we can house our communities and in really interesting ways. And so to make this introduction, we've got Dr. Shaneen Fantin, who will give us a lovely introduction.
Get this at the right height. Welcome back, everyone, and thanks once again to everyone for being here today and to Cairns Regional Council for hosting such a fantastic event. So I'd like to introduce you to the presenters for the next session, Eloise Atkinson and James Legge. You also have me, Shaneen Fantin, and Sarah Mort on the discussion panel. Before I tell you more about the excellent architects and presenters for this session, I want to talk about housing models and housing diversity. The last session showed us how housing and planning can respond to current climate and social changes and adapt to future needs to create more resilient communities. In this session, we're going to look at successful housing models from other parts of Australia and around the world that can be adapted and applied potentially to Far North Queensland. So as Ellen Buttrose, our Cairns City architect, has explained during her introduction, there are housing gaps and limitations in the market in Far North Queensland. And one of the key focus areas raised in the Growth Strategy 2050 is the need for a better range of housing types for our diverse community. I am a third-generation local who lives on the south side on Yurinji country in a kind of 60s Queenslander. And I've been renting out the bottom of our house for about 10 years, mainly to women, older women in need of housing. I've also seen Cairns grow and expand since the 1970s. I remember in the 1980s when people were building a lot of small-scale unit developments across most areas in Cairns. And I remember when Deicke bought the Cannons Farm at Girrawonday, White Rock, and developed it into forest gardens. I recall the public trepidation. Such small blocks at 480 square metres and small houses, so many gardens to maintain. 40 years on, and Forest Gardens, I think, is a better example of suburbia for Cairns than many of our current developments. That's my opinion. It has great public amenity, retained and enhanced existing waterways, and a proper urban centre. It has a diversity of lot sizes and shady pedestrian and bike paths. A fairly simple suite of things you would seem to achieve. One of the elements that most of our greenfield suburbs lack, including Forest Gardens, are real medium density and multi-res housing options. It's hard to find a unit outside of the city centre and surrounding suburbs. They are rare and often older stock. Instead, we continue to build single-family homes on individual detached lots on greenfield agricultural land. And the way land is developed is generally to maximise financial return. It usually has little concern for history, ecology, country, views to landscape, waterways, and environmental controls and concerns. We also know houses that are getting bigger and housing lots are getting smaller, creating heat island effects in new suburbs, which are not being adequately mitigated with appropriate landscape design and green spaces. So as architects, developers and planners in Far North Queensland, we know that there is a need for different housing models because we often get inquiries about cooperative housing models, tenant in common models, and infill housing, where groups of related or like-minded people want to purchase land, build, and share everything from laundries and communal areas to dining areas, parking and storage. However, it's really hard to bring these ideals and models to fruition when there are very few examples locally to show people. So how do we move from the vision of a quarter-acre block with a detached house and yard, which, Andrew and James has said is a contentious point for us, to a lovely tropical cooperative living environment adjacent to a community garden or a riparian corridor? This is my provocation for the day. How can this typology become a more typical part of Cairns? It is encouraging to see the investment in social and affordable housing in Cairns since 2023 and more accommodation for students and people with disability. But we also need more diverse housing models like the one that Damian has showed us earlier today and like the examples that James has also given, that they cater for extended families living together, ageing in place, single young people's housing or sharing with friends. And as Ellen said, that are also culturally and socially responsive. I know that some of the audience may be sceptical about the ideas offered by experts from other places who may not be as familiar with the tropical climate or economic environment as we locals are. However, we should know that to learn, to grow, to adapt and to experience from other places, and that we need to listen and learn from others. Eloise and James have a long history of developing and implementing diverse housing models under a broad range of conditions and contexts. They understand how planning and development processes, community and design all come together to create new housing options. We hope you find this session inspirational and a provocation for change. So who are our great speakers and panel members in this session? We have Eloise Atkinson, who's from Brisbane, a Brisbane-based architect with 30 years of experience in the design of social and affordable housing. She's been collaborating with local and state governments as well as community organisations for a very long time. Eloise has advocated for well-designed housing through her role as independent chair of the Brisbane Housing Company, where she sat on the board for the last 17 years. For the last 5 years, Eloise has been a key advisor to the Sharing with Friends Foundation, assisting in developing innovative housing models for older women at risk of homelessness. Her other housing work includes her role on the reference group of the Ellen Whitty Trust, which supports Brisbane Logan Zero project and seeks to prevent and end homelessness. So there's a lot of experience there. James Legge is a founding director of 6 Degrees in Melbourne, which is an award-winning architecture practice. He's also a founding member, or was a founding member of Nightingale Housing. Nightingale, if you haven't heard of it, is a not-for-profit organisation delivering homes that are socially, financially and environmentally sustainable. With a passion for community-minded and sustainable housing, James has led numerous award-winning projects that challenge traditional housing models in Australia. His expertise extends to urban design, policy development and master planning, where he's dedicated to shaping the future of Melbourne and advocating for better housing design across the country. James sits as a foundational member of the Nightingale Housing Board originally. So Nightingale's a really interesting model that James is going to talk about today, which takes the developer out of the equation, interestingly. And it's a model that's been implemented multiple times in Victoria and I think in Adelaide is happening as well, and I think in Western Australia. And it would be really interesting to see if that model could be applied to Far North Queensland. On our panel today, we've got Sarah Mort, who's a multi-award-winning town planner and development manager. With her business partner, James Mort, they lead the design and construction of My Haven. So since establishing My Haven, they have designed and constructed over 100 residential projects, many in partnership with not-for-profit community-based organisations, resulting in a deep understanding of the challenge of building in the wet tropics. Through their close collaboration with the Cairns community sector, they have also established the largest portfolio of NDIS specialist disability accommodation in the Cairns region, which has been recognised for its high quality and innovative design solutions. And then there's me on the panel, Shaneen Fantin. I'm an architect, a project manager, a researcher with 30 years experience. I currently partner with organisations to navigate complex initiatives, particularly in health, housing, arts and First Nations-led projects. I'm a member of the Queensland Urban Design and Places panel for the state government. I'm a member of the Cairns Regional Council Industry Reference Group. I'm co-chair of the First Nations Advisory Committee for the Australian Institute of Architects, and I'm an adjunct as pro at a couple of universities. But the key thing to remember is I'm here and I'm local, and I'm passionate about design for the tropics, and also for championing for First Nations design processes that respect and celebrate country. So, I'd now like to begin our session. Please give our speakers a round of applause, and I'd like to invite Eloise Atkinson to the stage. Thank you.
It's good to be a bit taller than Shaneen. I can put that up a bit. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me. I love being in Cairns. I love the heat. I'm a little bit cold in here, but taking my wrap off. I guess there's never been so much public discussion about the Australian housing system and the housing market as there is now. So it's timely that Ellen's brought this symposium together. There has been a really significant shift over my lifetime on how we value housing. It really is no longer about just a place to live, I say just, but a place to live, about home, about shelter. In Australia, it really is about generating wealth and about real estate. And, this redefinition of housing, and I often think, when I grew up, middle-class family, nobody I knew had a second house, unless they had a combined family holiday house with, 6 other members of the family. You bought a house, you lived in it. As you got more children, you did your alts and ads, or if that wasn't possible, you bought another house. But the redefinition of housing has affected the way that we're designing our buildings. It's affected the cost of the buildings, the lack of choice and options, and particularly for those of the most marginalised communities. And so therefore it really does have an effect on the way that our cities are being shaped, both from a built form point of view, but also from a social perspective. And, as you've all read in newspapers and heard on the radio, housing right across the continuum is under pressure. But I'm going to talk today really about the social and affordable housing sector. So what I wanted to do is just give you a bit of a overview of the housing landscape, and Ellen's already done a little bit of that for Cairns. Talk a bit about the housing continuum and how it all works together. I want to show you, and I'm hoping that Andrew's going to be very excited, a couple of projects. One, a new housing project in Brisbane for a First Nations group. I want to talk about the role of the community housing sector and how it is part of the housing solution, and particularly, obviously, to focus on Brisbane Housing Company. And lastly, I hope I can get through it all, I want to give you a good uplifting story about a new co-housing model, as Shaneen mentioned, for older women, which has just got its BA this week, so we're very excited that it's about to start on site after not quite as many years as Damian has been doing his project, but still a significant amount of time. So I suppose I should... So, despite Australia being the 5th least populated country in the world, we have the 2nd most expensive housing, which is probably not a surprise to anyone. But we are the 2nd most after Hong Kong, which does seem to be extraordinary. So, in Queensland, I guess we could be excited that we're now one of the 2nd most expensive housing, but in Brisbane at least. But you can see Cairns is significantly, has gone up, and as I understand it, that is increasing considerably all the time at the moment, and your growth strategy is obviously trying to address that. But I think what's more alarming than just those raw numbers, which are surprising enough in themselves, is how that relates to income. So in 1996, the median Australian house price was about $170,000, and that was about 2.5 times the average income. So 30 years later, 2024, the median house price is now $807,110, which is about 8 times the average annual earnings, which is about 100,000. And of course that is worse depending on where you live. I think that's on it, that's not the right one, big one. So despite the house prices, a large majority of the country still has the aspiration of the Great Australian Dream and of owning their own home. About 67% of Australians either own their own home or have a mortgage. And of those 31% who are renters, many of those people do have the aspiration to one day own their own home, perhaps a lot later than they thought they would. And even though that's only changed marginally since the 1970s, which was the peak of home ownership, which was about 70%, what is interesting and is just who was actually owning those homes. So in the 1970s, about 60% of 25 to 29-year-olds did actually own their own home, and now that's about 30%. So there's obviously a very big shift in the demographics and that generational home ownership. And I think we saw that pretty clearly across the last federal election as a kind of important topic. So the story is pretty similar in Queensland. It's 63.5%. We do apparently have the lowest home ownership across the country, across all the states, not the territories. So we're really in an environment where housing prices and rents are growing faster than wages. Low-income households, on the latest Hilda report that looks at housing across the country, low-income households could afford 1% of the houses that were for sale. We've got 170,000 households who are on the public housing wait list in the country, 122,000 on any night who are experiencing homelessness. And according to the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, a projected housing supply that is startlingly low. So, this crisis, apparently Australians are the only people who use crisis all the time in these things, but anyway, it's as Shaneen said, I've been with the Brisbane Housing Company for 17 years, and I can tell you in all that 17 years, it has felt like it has been in crisis, certainly for the people that we house. And it's largely been a failure to deliver, and also, of course, there's some complex demand issues as well, but a failure to deliver enough housing of all types across the continuum. And each part of the continuum has an effect on the other part of the continuum. So, while I spend most of my life in the social and affordable housing area, everything that's being done up this other end of the spectrum also has an effect on what's going on for the area that I'm mostly in. And of course, the people down that end of the spectrum have far less choices than the people up this end of the spectrum. So in terms of social housing, as you probably all know, it's really geared to people on very low and low incomes. It can be managed either by government or by registered community housing providers. The rent is usually set at 25% of household income, and it has very strict means testing, which has meant that over the years that social housing has become more and more residualised to those who are at high needs or very high needs, which was very different than where it was post-war, when it was really for working people. Affordable housing has lots of different definitions in terms of how it's understood, and I've sort of come to the point where I sort of refer to it as social affordable housing, because there is lots of affordable housing in the private sector, but it's just more affordable than the really expensive housing. So it's not trying to address low to moderate income households, which is the area of affordable housing that most of the community housing providers are looking at. It can be owned and managed by community housing providers or by for-profit organisations. The rent is usually set at 75%, sometimes up to 80% of market rent, but in the true social affordable housing, that rent is also capped at 30% of people's income in order to maintain its affordability. and the people who are being housed in affordable housing generally is wider than those in social housing, and it takes into account what we call key workers, so people working in retail, cleaners, early career nurses, early career emergency services, etc. And then the other area that I will talk about, which relates to the older women's housing, is the affordable ownership up this end of the spectrum. And there are plenty of different schemes across the country, government schemes and private schemes of shared ownership. And I guess it's really has been an effort to try and get people into ownership, helping them get into ownership for the first time. And there are lots of different ways it can be done, but as a principle, it's really about somebody owning buying part of their dwelling or their home, and then perhaps the other part they may pay rent on, or there might be it might be just divvied up if the property sold at the end. So lots of different ways that can be achieved, but really with the ultimate aim of getting people into affordable home ownership. So in the 40 years between the 1980s and the 2021, the number of people living in social housing has decreased significantly, and that's what I'm meaning. And we all know that all the government money needs to be as well spent as possible, and that it's all got to work harder. But the reality is we have reduced, in the country, we've reduced it from nearly 5%, 4.9% to 3.8%. And just for comparison, because I recently spoke with some Austrians at a housing function, their social housing across Austria is about 24%, and though in Vienna itself it's about 42% of the population live in some kind of publicly funded housing. The Netherlands is 29%, the UK is about 17%, and not surprisingly, New Zealand and Canada are about the same as us. And I guess it's just that it is, if you think about that continuum, the people down the far end are being squeezed and squeezed in terms of who becomes eligible for that social housing, which affects every other part of the continuum. In terms of social housing, about 72% in Queensland is managed by the government. It's public housing, about 16%. Community housing across the state, about 4.4 state-owned managed Indigenous housing, and then Indigenous community housing. I think in Cairns, your state-owned managed Indigenous housing is about 14%, and not surprisingly higher than the rest of the state. The government has put a target. The new LNP government, and not so new anymore, has kept the target that the Labor government had of 53,500 new social houses before 2044. In fact, the LNP brought, I think, the Labor government had it out to 2046, so they even kind of crunched that very significant number even further. So that means we need to be building, just to help people with their maths, about 2,800 houses per year in order to meet that target, and we have traditionally been building about 500 units. So it's a massive build that we're looking at to try to achieve that. So this is one of the projects that is trying to achieve that. There really are, and I want Andrew to get excited, because there really are some wonderful social and affordable housing projects being built right across the country. And in my experience, it's the first time I've experienced all levels of government really honing in on the issue. So Murray Bar is a project by Deicke Richards Architects, who a practice I worked with for 30 years. Murray Bar means beautiful place in the local Jagera language. And like a lot of the projects that are happening across the country, it is trying to challenge the status quo in where public social housing has been at for the last kind of decade. and really trying to respond to specific needs and also focusing very much on community. So the site that this project is, which is a regeneration project, is on the former site of the Joyce Wilding hostel at 8 Mile Plains, which is about 16 kilometres southeast of the Brisbane CBD. And the hostel has served as a refuge for vulnerable First Nations women and children since the 1970s. In fact, Senator Neville Bonner actually got married at the hostel in 1972, so it's had a long history. The project provides supported transitional housing for First Nations women and children and is operated by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Community Health Service, which is commonly called ACE. At the front is the community building, which you can just see the edge of going up to the front stairs, which provides the support services, many of which have been there since the 1970s, and then there's some housing behind that. It's a pretty unusual site. It has had an extensive First Nations history for a long time, both with the hostel and the supported services and accommodation, but also as a safe community space. That's the M1 going between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, the jagged line, which is pretty intense. You can see the intensity of the townhouse development to the north, and the site has a lot of remnant bushland, koala habitat, bushfire ratings, everything that you could throw at it. This is what happens with social and affordable housing. You always get the really complicated sites. No one gives you a nice, clean site that's easy to work with. But you can just, amongst all that green, much of which is protected vegetation, there is also some existing elders accommodation on the bigger site. So as part of this, the project is smaller, but around it, the whole site has had a long history, as I said, with the local First Nations people, and there is some efforts to redevelop some of that older elders' housing as well. I think what's pretty interesting about this project also is that there was significant consultation, not only just at the beginning, but throughout the project with ACE, who, as I said, are the operators, but also with the previous tenants and with the elders who live on the site, but beyond it as well. Oh, that's a weird... that came out a bit strangely, but anyway, not to worry. The master plan it's not that clear on that drawing. Oh, that's right, I've got this, haven't I? But this is the community hub, so and which becomes the front door for the site, and obviously where anybody that's a visitor would come through that space first. And then there's a series of residential quadplexes around a common community space. Interestingly, when the discussions were first talked about how that site would be configured, my colleague who was doing the work talked about casual surveillance, which, you know, in architecture and planning terms is a very nice thing. It's all soft and cuddly. Well, it was not taken very well by the people in the workshop who didn't like the idea of surveillance too much, given their past history. So it did come down to the former CEO, Jodie Curry, putting that into plain language of saying, we stay safe when we can keep eyes on things, which I think from now on I might use instead of saying there's casual surveillance. There's 33 units and as quadplexes, as I said, and a combination of studios, 1s and 2 bedrooms. I might move so you can see that through there. The consultation is unusual in public housing. The work I've done and the practice has done for a long time for not-for-profit organisations, community organisations, often does include significant consultation, but the government tends not to do that very often with specific projects. So it was fantastic that this project had such genuine consultation throughout. And I think it did make a big difference to design choices, the earthy kind of low maintenance materials that were used. There was a real sense about trying to make the way you navigated the site and also the units really easy to move around. There was a real sense of understanding that the people who were coming to live here were transitioning from traumatic or very precarious circumstances, and just some really functional things like the windows go right down to the ground where possible, or very low and are translucent to allow natural light, but also to accept that many people may feel safer lying on the floor rather than in beds, and just kind of working with some of the practicalities of that. Oh, God. All right, well, I'm going to keep... I did ask to get a 10-minute warning, but we're already there. So I'm just going to quickly work through this then. This is the community building, which sits at this is the back of it, sitting at the front. Elaine Chambers was an Indigenous artist who worked right from the beginning again with motives throughout the site. And this is the community hub right at the back of the building, the back of the site, which is a space for gatherings, for ceremony, but also reflections. And while it looks very simple, because it is in a bushfire zone, there was lots of complexity in terms of bringing that space together. I am really conscious that I've totally overestimated how much I can say in the period, so I'm just going to zip through this a little bit. I did want to just say this is an Ahuri, obviously, diagram, but every level of government obviously has important levers to pull in terms of housing. For many years it has been left to the state governments with funding coming through the federal government, but in fact all levels have a big role to play, and in fact if everybody doesn't play their role, we really can't move the dial very far. So I did want to just talk about, as I said, the community housing sector. So as well as the government sectors, obviously the community housing sector has a lot to offer, and I've been recently told by the Housing Minister that we should all be very excited with the budget on the 24th of June, and we'll be excited about how much money will be coming our way, so let's see. Brisbane Housing Company is the largest community housing provider in Queensland. There's some dispute about who owns how many things, but let's just go with that for the moment. It was importantly came together between the Queensland State Government and the Brisbane City Council in 2002, and I think that is important because it was because they came together to create the company. They've both been very supportive and worked really closely together with us. We have about 2,000 apartments in the Brisbane area, largely in the Brisbane area. And as I'd said before, in terms of how the rents work, we charge 74.9% of market rent and then adjust that for 30% for income levels. We're a Tier 1 Tier 1 community housing provider, which means we do the whole suite in terms of development, but we also do all tenancy management as well. We do largely house single households because that was when the organisation, the company started, that was the big hole, because the state government did house families quite well, but it was single people who were really missing out. And now a lot of those people have stayed with us for for 20 years and are now ageing in place. So certainly the demographic has gone up significantly. We have 45 buildings, and we'll have 50 in the next couple of years. So the aim is to get up to 3,500 units within the next, I think, 5 years. And there you can see that, we can see that the buildings down here when we first started are much simpler kinds of buildings than what we are now developing. So, you know, that's a 20-year period in which the organisation has become more sophisticated, the buildings have become more sophisticated, and the grant programs have become more sophisticated. So I did want to just talk briefly about how that funding has changed. There's two very important programs that are currently changing the funding landscape across Australia, well, mainly across Queensland first and Australia, and that's the Housing Infrastructure Fund, the HIF, and the Housing Australia Future Fund, the HAF. And I've been trying to convince some local government to have a HOF, so we could just have the HIF, HOF, HAF. But so if Cairns would like to take that up, you know, I won't patent it. The difference in this housing model is that it is about creating an investment fund that generates enough money that can then fund housing. So very quickly from what we're doing, we're getting funding from Housing Australia as the senior debt, and they're putting in about 70% of that funding for over a commitment to 7 projects, but we hope to 12. And then we have an institutional investor, ART. Some of you are probably in the Australian Retirement Trust. Some of your money is coming our way, who are funding 30% of that. But as we love to say in the community housing sector, subsidised housing needs a subsidy. So the way that it works, because we do need to pay those investors back, is that we get a subsidy from the state government for each of those apartments over 20 years. And at the end of that 20 years, BHC will pay all of that back and we will retain the properties in perpetuity. This is the first project across Queensland that has been funded through the HIF program. It's it's a small project, the smallest of the ones that we're doing, 34 units in Chermside, so incredibly well located. I'm not going to go through all that because we'll run out of time, but I did want just to show you the quality of the finishes in the projects that we do. And the Minister was there this week, so, you know, he was excited about it. We are, as I said, there are 7 projects that are being funded. Of course, the institutional investors need a big chunk of funding, which they have in these projects. So we currently have all 7 projects in construction or just about to be. Toowoomba's the last one to start in construction. So we've got projects at the Gold Coast, Toowoomba and Redcliffe, as well as Brisbane. And because I've probably got 1 minute left, I will talk to you about the project that I guess, weirdly, I've been doing this work for 30 years. This is the project people, family, friends, most want to talk to me about. So I'll talk about it briefly. It's a co-housing project for older women, as it says there. This is a very excited group of women because they've got a BA, as I said the other day. I guess the whole premise was, you probably have read a lot in the news about older women becoming the fastest group who are at risk of homelessness. That tsunami isn't here yet. We think it's going to come in the next 10 years. But certainly many of them have raised children, looked after elderly parents, had successful working careers, owned businesses, owned homes, all of those things, and for various reasons have found themselves in the private rental market. In fact, 44% of women over 45, single women over 45, are in the private rental market, insecure tenure, unaffordable rents, and quickly depleting any money that they do have. So they're not Damian's missing middle, but they are another missing middle, which is, they're not eligible for social housing because they've got too many assets, which might be their very small superannuation, and they don't have enough assets to be able to get any kind of a mortgage, and of course, due to their age, that's very difficult anyway. So this group of women, who are extraordinary, came together. They all had come from Zonta, but had got frustrated with this position that older women were in, and decided after many conversations that we had around the continuum, can't help everybody on it, where do you want to put yourselves? They said what they really wanted to do was create affordable home ownership for these group of women. As I said, many of whom had owned homes before. And the idea was really that they could come together with the enjoyment of living with like-minded women, age in place, have the privacy, importantly the autonomy, and also have, you know, company when they chose it. So they'd had a sense that, you know, in public housing they would never know who they were living next to. The share houses they were in were very difficult. But if they could choose to come together, pool their resources, then they could share with friends. So it's a really simple concept, 5 women coming together for mutual benefit, small individual dwellings, and some shared internal and external space. It would be funded through the women's superannuation. And at the time that we started the project in 2021, the average woman retiring at that time had about 120,000 in their super. It's now about 150, and for men it's about 270. So, you know, it's not a lot of money to expect to live for the next 20 years of your life. We did talk about car parking very early on, and we agreed that we couldn't spend money on car parking, so we talked about reducing that as much as possible. The idea was that they would always be well located, the projects for services and shops, that the group would autonomously, that they would own it and that they would manage it. And most importantly for this group, which was a group of 70-year-old women, very insightful, was they wanted to make sure that they were creating something that could be replicated throughout the state, throughout the country. So that was always one of our considerations. The women were to be single, over 55, on low or paid work or pension, had the superannuation, as I said, and didn't have the capacity to buy something themselves. I won't talk too much about why they chose co-housing, but we can come to that at some other point. Because I think this is important. One of the reasons why this project has been so successful is the foundation, the women who set the foundation up, their superpower was actually running a series of workshops with the women that had put their hand up through some media publicity, through the work that they did. I think within a month they had about 400 women on their list who were interested in the concept. So they didn't just go and come to me and say, well, let's design something for them. We did a number of workshops over 10 weeks. We went on site visits so that everybody was talking about the same kind of space, and through that we refined what the thing would be, which was not, to be fair, largely around architecture, because it's a pretty simple diagram. It was really a lot about what they were prepared to share, what they weren't prepared to share, and how they as a group would come together. And the workshops were also important in finding the other 4 people that they wanted to live with, because it was not ever an idea that those women would be chosen for them. So as I said, they've now finally got their BA after a lot of struggles, and maybe we can talk about that in the panel session. It's a site at Darra. This is the shared house, which is really the size of a typical domestic kitchen, laundry, does have an extra bathroom in there. And then this is the little studio that is an individual unit for each of the women. It does look like, and is the same size as probably a 4-bedroom house, actually. The big difference being that they each have individual bathrooms. There is no cooking facilities, or very limited cooking facilities, in their own space. In their own space. And that was largely around planning issues about what we were going to call this thing, but because we didn't want to make it multi-res. But also important that the co-housing idea, the idea of living together, of pooling resources, meant we didn't really want to be putting in 5 kitchens, which would actually add to the cost. And the project has just come in from the contractor who was doing it at cost, and it's come in at about $850,000. So it's still a significant amount of money to try and find together. There have been a number of challenges right from the beginning. The women had said to me, why isn't everybody doing this? This is an excellent idea. Look at all the people who want this to happen. But throughout the project, and it's taken, as I said, we started really properly. They got the land in 2023, which was donated to them by a philanthropic friend. Every time we've made a decision about how the building would, how does it get defined in the planning scheme, would affect what it gets, how it's considered in terms of the National Construction Code, which would affect how it was going to be managed, which would affect its legal position. So it has been a very complex position just to get 5 little things, but really worth it. And I'm going to leave it there before Alan comes and sits on me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll just adjust this up a little bit. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here up in Cairns, in much warmer climes than Melbourne that I left. I've been here for a few days and it's been delightful. I'm going to run through a series of different housing models, starting in Europe before coming back to Australia. I'm not suggesting that all, or indeed any of them in particular, is suitable to Cairns, but what I have come to understand over the past few years is that it is the financial models that we need to be thinking about and considering. The status quo is unlikely to deliver the housing we need over the coming decades, and we should be thinking about alternatives that could form part of the solution. So there'll be a quick trip through some European models. I've got quite a lot of slides to get through there, so I will be racing through some of them. And then coming back to Australia, I'll take you through Nightingale and then some other projects that 6 Degrees has been involved with historically, but also more recently as well. The key thing, I guess, that I'm trying to get across is that there are many different models that have been tried and tested overseas and here, but Australia does tend to stick with the status quo, and it's quite difficult to convince government, but also finance and banking in particular, that we should be looking at some of the other models. And I should start a timer just so that I don't go over. Having spent some delightful time up here over the last couple of days, I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet and that I've been exploring over the last couple of days. So thinking about housing and housing models. To start with, I think it's useful to think of another spectrum. We've been looking at spectrums today a little bit, across which housing is often delivered, from the purely speculative profit-driven developments at one end through to fully subsidised models at the other end. And I think lots of the stuff that I'll be showing you here fits in around here. I'll be showing you some cooperative developments, some deliberative developments, citizen-led, also architect-led, which perhaps is where Nightingale fits in. I'm not suggesting that this covers everything, but I think it's worthwhile thinking that there are a number of different models and scenarios, financial and organisational and legal, that various models sit within. So first of all, Berlin, Baugruppen and cooperative projects. So Baugruppen and cooperative projects, co-housing cooperatives, members have equal rights, no direct ownership, rent determined by 30-year loan repayments, rent drops dramatically at the end of the loan, members can't speculate but can pass on to the apartment to a family member who can meet the financial commitment. Baugruppen, which I'm sure quite a few of you have heard about, the Baugruppen is essentially, it stands for build group. It's a collection of individuals that replaces the developer. So essentially, 20 apartment Baugruppen, there would be 20 loans and 20 homeowners. Now, the German banks accept this model. Trying to do this in Australia is just impossible, just about. So a bank looks at you and just says, seriously, there's going to be 20 different loans on this one development? You're dreaming, it's never going to happen. Big Yard's a good example of this particular type, Baugruppen project in Berlin. It's a number of apartments and townhouses around centralised space, amazing centralised space that they all look out onto. They've all got their own, or the townhouses have their own roof terraces. And this was a collection of individuals led by Zadendorf Architects, who was one of them, and they all came together, organised their finances together and built together, so there's no developer involved. Interestingly, and we're talking about this, I think we'll talk about this a little bit, I think Australia does need to get used to the idea that you can share amenity and that we should be looking at our open spaces, for example, as shared amenity rather than having the preoccupation that we tend to have with privacy. Another Baugruppen project, so they've got various construction techniques that they're putting these things up quite quickly. This is CLT and mass timber with steel, so it's a sort of composite system, and then it's rendered, and this is done in sort of high-rise developments around Berlin. Again, a Baugruppen. This is Ritterstrasse R50, another Baugruppen project. Very simple construction techniques, and the owners in this particular case were given essentially a shell which they then fitted out themselves. So they pulled the money together, organised themselves, got the building, obviously done by a builder, but then the shells that they actually then could spend the money as they could or as they could afford to gradually over the years. And this project called Sprayfeld, which is part Baugruppen and part cooperative. It includes standard apartments and cluster units around shared kitchen and living areas. It's quite an interesting model. So although some of them are Baugruppen and they end up owning their own apartments, others have chosen a cooperative development model where they own a smaller unit, or bedsit if you like, which then shares some living communal spaces. The architecture is unimportant, I think, in lots of ways. The architecture is there to facilitate these projects. You'll notice in quite a few of them, in both these and the cooperative ones I'll show you from Switzerland, that the buildings themselves land on the ground and then it's up to the residents what they do around it. And I quite like it, that there's quite clean, often quite clean architecture coming down to sort of a cacophony of all sorts of things that happen on the ground as the residents move in, and it gradually changes over time, and they make these spaces their own. They certainly make the balconies their own, as you can see. So off to Vienna. So some interesting statistics here, which were mentioned briefly earlier. So a population of 2 million in a country of 6 million. Population growth's only 15,000 per annum, so quite low compared with Australia. Very dense city, in fact denser than Manhattan. 62% of the population are living in rented housing, owned mostly by non-profit organisations and the state. 45% of Viennese housing is long-term social housing. So they have a history of social housing models, Hoffman Housing and Garden Estates. So what we know of as apartments, essentially the condominium or strata title, there's about 2%, so very few. Build to rent, limited profit developer, very common, so various types. A developer-led housing, no client involvement until residents move in, apartments rented individually by builder or developer. Or B, the developer-led co-housing, slightly different, but with certain rights given to the association, the housing association that they do it with. Apartments, again, rented individually from the builder-developer. So this is possible, and the city supports between 25 to 30% of the build cost, provided that the developer builds to a certain square metre rate, and that profits on the money that they put in are limited to 3.5%. Imagine trying to do that to a developer here. And it's on their own capital resources, and that they also offer unlimited tenure. Social housing, subsidised housing, similar to the rent model, but state-owned, also very common. So they're offered both through housing associations that tend to do this, or through the state. Then collaborative co-housing. type. So financed by developer, organised by or in collaboration with associated apartment rented or owned commonly under control of association and individual. So a little bit like the company title in Australia. Or the group home model, organised and financed by associations, collective, apartments owned commonly under contract between association and individuals. You own a share in an association which in turn owns the apartments. Sargfabrik, which I'm about to show you, is actually more common in this type of model in Switzerland, which we'll get to. And then community of property owners or the Baugruppen, and so this also happens there. This is Sargfabrik. I think this was a 1980s project, so it's been around for a while. It's a cooperative development. It involves all sorts of apartments, but it also has a public bathhouse or swimming pool, a restaurant, and has various arts things going on there as well. So, and basically, you don't own the apartment. You are a member of it, and you have a right to live in one of those apartments. Interestingly, what struck me about the rooftop gardens is they look like backyards of Australian backyards. You almost see a Hills Hoist in the distance. This one is Vaughan and Mitkinder, which is co-housing deliberative from the 80s. And this essentially was 16 families, so this was citizen-led. 16 families and 25 children got together and built themselves a set of apartments with shared garden space and a kindergarten, which over time, and one of the problems or issues with some of these sorts of models is that people grow up and move out, and so this tends to be now a bunch of grandparents living there. The kindergarten is no longer used as a kindergarten. So there are things that have to be thought about. Vaughan project, it's a Baugruppen co-housing project. Interestingly enough, for this one, 25% of the GFA is communal facilities. So a bunch of people have got together to build themselves an apartment. They've replaced the developer and they've made some decisions around keeping their apartments relatively small, but having a whole lot of shared facilities. So it includes some obvious things, but then some less obvious things, such as a shared kitchen, where they can, if you have a small apartment, you can still have a large dinner party if you book this space, and or a facility they use for various things and rent it out to help make money for the OC, essentially. A library, workshop, etc., and again, rooftop. So across to Switzerland, Zurich in particular. Cooperative housing sits between subsidised social housing and home ownership. So 8% of people in Zurich own houses, 45% in the rest of Switzerland. 20% of housing is cooperative in Zurich, which is a huge number. So, organised and financed by the cooperative, apartments owned commonly under contract between association and individuals. You own a share in an association which in turn owns the apartment. Cooperative organisations like to have both leased and purchased land models for their developments. Easier to get a leased land model up and going due to the less capital outlay at the beginning. So the government will, and I'll show you a couple of these sites, will offer a long-term lease on a piece of land that a cooperative will then pull together. So it costs about €1,000 to join a cooperative, and then it costs you about €50,000 to live in one. You then pay rent at less than market for better than market apartment. But if you leave, you just get your $50,000 back. Essentially, it encourages people to move into a cooperative and stay there. So it allows the lower middle class and the middle class to have decent, well-serviced housing suitable to their needs at all stages of life. Interestingly, rent gets better over time, over the years as the loans are paid off, and encourages people to stay. Also, which I think is key, you have a right to live in an apartment, but only one that suits your requirements. If you have a kid, you get a bigger apartment in the same community, but you get a bigger apartment because you need another bedroom. Your kids leave and go to uni or go and study overseas or move out, then you get a smaller apartment. Your rent changes proportionally as well, but you don't, essentially what happens quite often in some of these communities is otherwise they just get older and you have a whole lot of people living in family design or apartments designed for families that they're not using all the bedrooms. So in this particular model, it keeps things turning over. Swiki Sud, this is the cooperative housing. So you can see it's quite sort of sharp architecture, high quality build. Again, I think it's quite interesting what happens when they meet the ground and it's left to the residents to sort out. I quite like the way in which they occupy it and what they do with it. This one is Mares Alvornen, More Than Living. This land is owned by the state and was leased to a cooperative for 99 years. Multiple buildings and shared communal facilities, commercial, retail, hotel, public, primary, secondary schools. And they were built by the government. So this started off as a competition between a number of architects. Once the cooperative got together, they held a public competition amongst architects. They gave them a set of attributes they wanted this cooperative to have as aspirations, and then they held the competition, and that various buildings were awarded to various architects. So there's quite a different sort of language across the development. There's a shared ground plane, there's shared facilities, as there are in all these projects, but the ground plane is that the cars are removed from the ground plane and undergrounded, and it's quite a large community. Then the government came in and built a primary school, which is this one, and then they built a secondary school too. So this is supported very much by the government. Undergrounded cars. So just to remind you, before we move back to Australia, this is this spectrum I was talking about. Nightingale Housing. So who are Nightingale Housing? Housing for profit, so for people, not profit. It's a registered charity. It was a not-for-profit. It's now more recently become a charity. It's quite hard work to do that, but it's happened. Delivered over 600 homes, including over 137 homes for community housing providers, with another 200 plus in planning and construction. So they're fossil fuel-free housing, sustainability through reductionism. In other words, we take stuff out and try and keep it less expensive, so build less but give back more in the terms of communal spaces. Build with robust materials, make them thermally efficient so that they're actually inexpensive to operate for the purchasers. So we do put money into some of these sorts of things. Naturally ventilated, incredibly important in Melbourne in particular, where we have heat waves, and then we get, a week later we'll have a cool change coming through. We can instantly cool down our apartments if you've got good natural ventilation. Open stairs, which you have there's lots of them up here, but trying to convince developers generally in Melbourne is quite difficult to do. But the open stairs then encourages people to use the stairs rather than the lift. It encourages community, a sense of community. You bump into your neighbours, etc. Carbon neutral in operation, and we do that through 100% certified green power through an embedded network. Obviously, a whole lot of shared spaces to encourage community, and because people's apartments are relatively small, we want people to be able to live in these apartments if they have a family. It shouldn't just be, as it has in the past, this idea that you either live in an apartment because you're individual or maybe a couple. You should actually be able to live in here as a family. Some shared communal spaces, rooftop spaces, shared laundries, which incidentally end up being one of those key places where you bump into your neighbours and you get chatting. We've introduced bathhouses in a number of them simply because they won't usually have a bath, and there are kids living in these places. They'll have a shower, but people like to have a bath or be able to bathe their kids, particularly when they're little. Greenery throughout. Again, you wouldn't have that trouble up here, but it's quite difficult to convince things to grow in Melbourne, particularly on buildings. Small footprint living, compact and careful. Close to public transport, so we do try and do, Nightingale tries to put their buildings, most of them, sort of adjacent to or very close to good public transport. That way, ideally getting rid of cars altogether. I would argue that we've got a changing transport landscape which is allowing this to happen. I've not yet given up on the idea that there will be autonomous vehicles at some stage in the future. I think it's going to keep on changing our public landscape. It's changing with the degree to which people will now have a electric bike to get their kids around. That's happened in the last 5 or 10 years. And that's now, I would say, for many people, that is either their only car, inverted commas, or their second car. That many people no longer have 2 cars at least, and also a lot of people, particularly if they're living in good and close environments close to public transport, will just have one. Also won't have any cars, they'll use things like GoGet and FlexiCar. So I think this is something to keep an eye on, and I think there will be less and less need for car parking. Like-minded businesses at ground floor to help create active streetscapes. And then resident engagement. So the process is for a Nightingale project is that you register interest from the database. So there's a whole lot of people who have become Nightingale, who've joined Nightingale, if you like, at no cost. And then a new project comes along. It's advertised to the community, the Nightingale community, and we say that there's a new project here. If you're interested, come along to an information session. They come to an information session. There might be, well, the last one we did was in Brunswick Town Hall, and we filled it twice for 30 apartments. So there's obviously a lot of demand. And in those information sessions, we go through what the building is, what the design is, what the apartment types are, 1s, 2s, 3 bedrooms, etc., what the facilities are, and importantly, how much they're going to cost. And then after those information sessions, whoever's interested in that community says they're interested, and they're just about always oversubscribed, and then we essentially take, rather than putting the price up, which is what would happen in a traditional market, essentially the price is the price. It's whatever we can afford it to be at cost, and then we just simply draw names out of a hat to decide who those residents are. And those residents then come on a journey throughout the construction of the project, and they come along at various times during construction to see the building going up. And incidentally, through that process, they get to meet each other. And by the time they move in, they're already a small community. So some of the community stuff has already happened, and invariably, they've got a WhatsApp going. It becomes a bit of a nightmare for the builder, of course, because then instantly they're very involved in the WhatsApp, very involved in defects, and very well organised to sort it all out. So how's Nightingale a mechanism for affordability? I would hasten to say that I don't think Nightingale is affordable housing. I think it's more affordable, and we're just trying to do it without profit. I think affordability is a big issue across everything. At the moment, we're finding it quite difficult to actually build anything at the moment in Melbourne, and I think in other parts of Australia as well, simply because of the costs of housing, so the cost of construction. But simply put, the land costs us the same as it would for a typical developer. The consultants cost us the same as they would for a typical developer, but we have no marketing team. Nightingale has no marketing team. I keep saying I was a member of the board until very recently. We've got new blood coming in, and I've been on it for many years, so it's time for me to move on. Marketing team, so we've got no marketing team, we've got no display suite. We simply take people on tours of other Nightingale projects. We don't use real estate agents, which is a huge cost. We still obviously have construction costs, like we would for a for-profit organisation, and then essentially they have profit. What we have is cost of finance. So yes, we have to pay people who have lent us money, whether it's the banks or the super funds or whatever it is. But whatever we can get, however cheap we can get it, that finance, that's all we pay back. So there's no profit going to Nightingale per se. So it's housing at cost, sold at cost. 20% of it is affordable housing. So Women's Property Initiative, you've heard today, once again, reiterating that there's a big tsunami problem for many elderly women and lack of housing. Women Property Initiative have bought quite a few of the Nightingale more recent projects in this 20%. We do try and subsidise that, and we do that because, interestingly, there are also empty nesters who are interested in moving into community, and they might have a bit more money. And we're quite open about that. We say, well, yes, we do have a couple of 3-bedders here, and they're more expensive, and you're paying that because you want to live here, but you are subsidising these sorts of things as well. The smaller apartments, but also in particularly affordable housing that we're building into the Nightingale projects. They're tenure blind, so it's not like the cheaper ones get less finishes. Everyone gets the same. We've introduced something that is called a tile house apartment, which is essentially a 35 square metre bed sit. And these are very popular with WPI. because they're small and they're affordable. And yeah, typically, it's been difficult to do this because banks won't lend financing for these sorts of apartments. But with a community housing provider, it becomes more achievable. So just to show you a couple, this one is under construction. This is a 6 Degrees one. This also, I think, worth looking at. Some of you, I'm sure, know about Nightingale and Nightingale Village. This is essentially Nightingale Village. This one here without the cross on it is the Commons, which was the first one that Jeremy did with Breathe. And that was before Nightingale became a thing. He did that, kind of worked out where it went wrong and where it went right, and then bought the land across, which is just over here, for Nightingale 1. He just bought the land essentially and then ran around all his friends and architects trying to raise money to be able to afford this idea that he had. And Nightingale 1 came about. At that point, he then asked me to do Nightingale 2. Essentially, he had a database. He had an Excel spreadsheet of people who didn't, because he was oversubscribed to Nightingale 1. He said, here's some people who want one as well. Can you do the next one? And so that's kind of Nightingale came about like that. And we did Nightingale 2, which is over in Fairfield, and then Nightingale 3 was Andrew Maynard, and then the Village, which keep doing it, which is this whole set of them here, and then we're now doing this one here, the little red one, which is Nightingale Willemganga, which is under construction. So this is the Commons. There's Nightingale 1, and then these are other Nightingales through here, and the Village is down this way. So this is our site here, as you can see. If you know Melbourne or you know the area, this is the upfield line, and then Sydney Road is just over here with trams, and there's a bicycle path that goes through here as well. So it's incredibly well serviced in terms of public infrastructure. So this is really, the aim was to finish off this particular site. It's the bookend, if you like, to this little group of Nightingale projects. So this is what is currently under construction. You can see we're kind of bookending. We're continuing the expression of Nightingale 1 and then bookending it here and then turning the corner with these series as well. Nightingale 1 and then us, the Nightingale with Willemganga and the bookend. Nightingale 2 was the Nightingale project that we did. So now I'm just moving on to a few, quickly if I've got time, 6 Degrees projects, which takes us through, again, a few different models and things that we explored over the years. So Nightingale 2 in Fairfield was finished about 5 years ago. The open walkways, again, you've got lots of them up here, but it's quite difficult to convince people in Melbourne to do them, despite the fact that it means you've got dual access to light and ventilation, and you have spaces that are much nicer to bump into neighbours and have incidental chats with, so it's much better about forming community. And then some community spaces up the top, for example, on the roof deck. Earlier, about 15 years ago, we did this project, and this is just to show a few other quite different projects and lower scale, this particular one anyway, which was a piece of council-owned land. It was surplus land, it was contaminated land, so they held a public EOI and then tender. And I got together with a couple of other people, a builder and a remediation guy, and we looked at it and we won the tender in the end. And what we had to do was remediate the entire block of land, deliver the front 2/3 back to council as a public park, and then we were allowed to develop the back third. And I had been looking around for something like this somewhere I could afford close to the city and raise a family, and I had other friends who wanted the same sort of thing, so they bought in, and the planner bought in, and a whole sort of a small community kind of came in. So I guess you put this at the somewhere up from the speculative development, architect-led. Contaminated land, had to do all sorts of digging up, but because we had to do that, meant that we got to sort of terraform and manage the soil, which I'll get to in a second. I'd lived as a 10-year-old in a small village in England and had spent most of my free time in the local green. And so I had this idea that you could have a small green space that could be used by community locals, in particular people who are living on it but also adjacent to it. And so that's what this became, essentially 10 townhouses and a public park at the front. Because we were moving so much soil around, we undergrounded the cars, got rid of the cars, got them out of the way essentially so that we had essentially spaces and living spaces which opened out to the park. We managed the public-private interface through berms and through planting. I think that's, again, just coming back to that idea, I think Australians have to get this over the idea of absolute privacy. It becomes too much of a problem. Not sure what it's like up here, but in Melbourne we have people living in apartments and they've got screens that go up to 1.7 that they can't see through, and they're on their balconies. It's ridiculous. Simply because the people next door don't want to be looked at, even though they may be 20 metres away. So I think there's something there that we have to get used to, this idea of proximity, particularly in density. I think you can manage it in different ways, and it's a nuanced thing, and that we should be managing it in a nuanced way. So I was looking at the Italian and Greeks who are living around the area of Brunswick where this is, and they spent their entire summer and shoulder seasons out in the front terraces talking to each other and talking to the street. They were aware of the comings and goings. So although I had a huge fight with council, trying to get across the idea that I didn't want to have a fence or a wall between our living space and the park, go figure, which also was north, I had to convince them that private open space didn't have to be secluded private open space. It could be private open space and you could still manage the privacy in a way that you wanted. And as you can see, planting does a great deal. It takes a little while to get there, but it actually does a lot to sort of help manage that. This is when we moved in. It was chaos, and then finished. And you can see the trees are quite low, the berm's quite low, berm's there. The privacy's not quite managed, but after a few years, no, it's sorted completely, and the park gets used by everyone. It's a great place to bring up kids. The annual luge at Hell Street. And then basically lots of communal stuff that happens over the years. Now, at the same time, we then started doing Clyde Street townhouses. And I include this again because it's another smaller scale project. And this is essentially a much more repeatable, I guess, because the Hell Street project is, getting the wind up. Hell Street is a large site, unusual site. This is essentially two blocks brought together. And the important thing here again was removing the car parking, putting it all together so that we could pedestrianise the rest of it. And then there are 6 townhouses and 2 single-bedroom flats above the car parking. But it means that you've got shared amenity. And I think these are the sorts of things that we should be trying to encourage. And very quickly, Victorian Public Housing Renewal Project. This is a large project for government. Before the pandemic, they were trying to renew their public housing. The only way in which they were doing it was they had various walk-up, sort of 4-storey walk-ups. They were trying to, basically they had no money, the government wasn't giving them money, so the department essentially went out to the market and said, we need you to replace what's there, these 4-storey walk-ups without lifts, replace them with new plus 10%, and you can do what you want with the rest of it. So that's what's under construction. We've got sort of 6 buildings. This one here is public housing, and the rest are all private and are sold private. But the parking's undergrounded, and they've got a shared ground plane, pedestrianised ground plane, and everything's tenure blind, so you can't tell what's what. And they're sort of high quality apartments. So it'll be very interesting. They're just about to finish this project. It's coming to completion. And then the pandemic hit, and I won't dwell on these ones, and now we've got the big housing build ground lease model, and essentially what's happened now is that they are again going out to market public-private partnership, where essentially the government says, we want you to build, this old stock needs to come down, we want you to build this number of apartments, you will be responsible for them. You do it with a community housing provider who will look after them. We want you to look after the finance and the building. They must kick something in, I'm not sure what it is, and you need to maintain them over the next 40 years. In 40 years' time, you give us, they all revert to the government ownership, and we get our land back at the end of that 40-year lease period. So that's the new model, because they did get quite a bit, understandably, grief for selling off public asset. So that's happening in suburban. This is in Hampton. These are currently under construction as well. And then another one, GLM1, which is finished and they've moved in. Well, stage 1 is finished. Stage 2 is under construction, and stage 3 is on the drawing boards. So this is what's happening. So just, I guess, in finishing up and rounding off, I think it's important to understand, as I stated at the beginning, that there are all sorts of different models for delivering housing. And I think we have to try and get beyond the status quo and look at what others have done, what's been successful, what might be able to work here, what might not be able to work, what might be able to work in Melbourne, the Victorian government, but not necessarily here, or maybe it could, something can work here that doesn't work there. But I think we have to explore, it's not just about architecture, it's about finance, and it's about government, and it's about all sorts of things, and pulling all sorts of levers rather than just the levers that the right wing or the left wing argue about. And thank you.
All right, fantastic. We're going to kick off with Sarah. And Sarah, I think here you and James with MyHaven have had a long history in Cairns of doing quite innovative housing models, and in an environment that's got, you know, ups and downs of feasibility. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the alternate housing models that were presented today, and what you think might be some that are more applicable in the Cairns concept in terms of feasibility, but also how that relates to trends that you've seen locally and what that means for proposals in Cairns.
Thanks, Ellen. Really inspiring afternoon. So firstly, congratulations for you pulling this off. I think it's really significant for our community. Look, there's so many takeouts and so many lessons learned. James and I actually saw the very first Nightingale. My brother was the head builder on that project, and we were really blown away with the thoughts of innovation. So many things to share. One, you know, from the first session this afternoon, I said to Alan, you know, James and I actually benchmarked Bluefield in Cairns 10 years ago, and it was actually workshopping with Gary Warner at council and starting to think a little bit differently about how we could do small lot subdivision. It never fit the planning scheme, and it still doesn't fit the planning scheme, but we're able to prove how we could build 4 houses on one block of land in Parramatta Park, and actually we made each one of those houses freehold, which was also a bit of a benchmark. Because there is complications with body corporates, there always is, and there's also a culture to that with banks getting lending. But anyway, so we still need to do so much more. I love the idea of getting rid of the minimum lot size. That actually does my head in. I think at the end of the day, good design and density can all be resolved with good design and a bit of lateral thinking. Cars have always been the devil of planners and architects, and I don't know where that solution's going to be. In your idea with the women's co-op housing idea, I totally champion that. A lot of the housing work that we've done, it's actually been working with a lot of our smaller community access housing providers here. And we had worked with a women's group about during COVID actually to try and help exactly all the issues you've been trying to deal with. So the complexities of law, banks, culture, all these things need to be broken down. I love the research you've done overseas because we've got to change title. When I lived in Sydney as a town planner, it was the first time I learned about, I think it's called it's called company title. And it actually only exists in about Elizabeth Bay and Potts Point. But that was brought in back in the 1920s. And that's where you actually, and they still exist in Sydney, where you have a share ownership of this property. I think we can change the way banks think. I think it's time to change the way banks think. I see housing as essential infrastructure. Opportunities in Cairns to adopt some of the really good ideas we've thought about, and I think Cairns Council is thinking this way. I get really upset as I get older to see state government selling surplus land. I don't think it should be sold. I totally believe in the ground lease model. If you take the capital expenditure of land out of that model, right at the very beginning, you can accelerate the opportunity of bringing something into the market to make it affordable. We need to do that in Cairns. That is why James and I are doing the project at Cairns Airport. We're leasing that land for 50 years, and that makes it work for us. There's tiny pockets of surplus land in Cairns. James and I are always talking to the planners at council about how can we open that land up. So if you think of the railway corridor, which is only used twice a day or 3 times a day. There's lots of little pockets of land there that we could come up with some really cool infill housing solutions. I know from that conversation we had with the planners about a year ago, and the councillors came on board as well, and I know councillors actually identified tiny little blocks of land all over the inner city which actually could be repurposed for housing. That's enough.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, Sarah. And I think hearing that feasibility analysis and kind of your long learnings in this space is really absolutely beneficial. Shaneen, I'm going to hand over to you. You've done a lot of work in social housing, the social housing space right across Queensland. And seeing what we saw today, just your reflections on what might be applicable in the Cairns area.
Thank you. It's very exciting to listen to all these presentations today and get inspiration from them. I do think the easiest, we'll call it the low-hanging fruit for uptake, is Damian Madigan's option of infill housing, though I recognise completely what you said, Sarah, about the lot size being one of the constraints that we've got. So if there was a way that planning policy, since our planning scheme is getting reviewed at the moment and is going to be under review, if work could be done in that space to enable that to happen, because I think in many suburban areas of Cairns, there's a lot of informal cooperative housing happening anyway, whether we like it or not. People are just doing it because of the diverse backgrounds in different communities we have in Cairns, and I think everyone could probably think of a few examples that they know of. And so if there's a way to, you know, celebrate that and encourage it, and for it to be designed well and, you know, compliantly, that would be excellent. In terms of the things, I guess, that we do have to change our perception of how we want to live and perceptions of privacy and control of spaces. And I guess we've had this luxury in far north Queensland of always having, you know, a lot of space to ourselves that we can control. But also, going back to diverse communities again, that's a very, I think, can be in some ways a fairly Western idea of the world as well, you know, or particularly an Anglo idea of the world, because we've got a lot of communities, and I don't mean just Indigenous, I mean other kinds of diverse communities in Cairns, where people are happy to live in bigger family groups and to live together and share space. So it's just us kind of, I think, welcoming that kind of diversity into our lives. I think some of the challenges for us will be around when you build densely, then how do we still stay cool without living in eskies? And how do we control, when all the windows are open, you know, the oral privacy of spaces? So there's some of the challenges of design. And when we can't use rooftops for, you know, spaces, because we'll all bake, what other kinds of, how do we create the equivalent undercroft space, you know, in developments that's also then not flood prone? Yeah,
absolutely. How do we get that holistic approach happening, all in the pot together? Eloise and James, I'm actually quite interested to know how the conversations have changed in Victoria since Nightingale's kind of come about. And also I'm keen to understand, like with the sharing with friends, you had a lot of kind of discussions with authorities on how to make that work. Kind of the conversations perhaps anecdotally around the place, so with government but also with community and what it's meant to have these projects go.
Okay. Look, I think things have changed quite a lot since the first Nightingale was built. I think in many ways Nightingale showed to the rest of the development community that people are quite prepared to live in apartments if you give them the right sort of apartment with the right sort of stuff, and you form a community and you encourage the development of a community within those buildings. So I think that's changed, and there's a lot of the market down there, or the developers down there, are now talking about community and developing community and trying to put in the right sorts of things and looking at what Nightingale has done. But I think it was probably a zeitgeist thing to a degree as well, in that people, I mean, this is my own personal opinion, I think people in the larger cities anyway are getting used to the idea generationally of living in apartments. And it's not, it used to be when I was growing up probably, mostly just for poor people. That's how it was perceived. And you'd never live in a flat, as they were called, if you could avoid it. But then thinking a bit further back, people did. There were beautiful old flats down in St Kilda, and it was quite acceptable, and through South Yarra as well. So things change, and I think we can change community to become better at understanding that apartment living is fine. It's just different, and there are good things about it. And yes, you're living with a lot more people, but that density also brings stuff. And that's what I think we have to sell to the wider community, that you increase density, you'll actually improve a neighbourhood if you do it right. There'll be more people, the facilities will be better, it'll be able to support a better cafe and a wine bar because there's more people. You'll be able to go downstairs and get something rather than walk or get in your car and drive for 10 minutes to get something. So there are other things I don't think we do necessarily a good enough job at selling that, but I think it's gradually changing.
Yeah, it's really interesting at some of the Towards 2050 youth summits. A lot of the young people that were involved were like, I see my future in an apartment. Yep. Absolutely. How about you, Eloise, with the conversations with sharing with friends?
I guess 20 years in sort of with BHC, I think there are a lot of conversations anyway, and some of those are generational in terms of who's prepared to live in apartments or who want to live in apartments. I think that's been quite a change. I guess the thing about sharing with friends, and I'm really sorry I sort of underestimated how long everything was going to take anyway, so I didn't quite get to it all, but I think it's been really interesting for me because I have worked with a lot of what I would call inexperienced clients in terms of the development process, and often they have been not-for-profits, whether that's schools or others, who are just trying to get on with doing the work they do, which is usually for very marginalised communities. So they're just concentrating on that, and our role has been to advocate for them and to walk them through the development process. The thing that's been interesting with sharing with friends is I have learnt that if you want something done, what you need to do is just get a couple of 70-year-old women onto it, because they are like terriers. I am literally scared to pick up the phone because they're going to go, "Hello, darling, have you got those drawings?" And I'm like, "Well, you did say close of business and it's 9:30. And they're like, "Right, so shall I call back in an hour?" No, don't call back. So anyway, I've learned a lot about that. But they, at the same time, they were inexperienced in the development process. They were also trying to, so they were managing all the side of the women and the residents and trying to work out what the legal situation would be, how they would lease the land, how they'd get the funding together, all those things that are a whole nother world. And they didn't actually have very many examples. So they were learning all of that from scratch. And all the consultants, the architects, the planners, the lawyers, we're all doing it pro bono. So there's also that, you've got to get everybody involved. But just the passion with how much need there was around this issue and how many of these women did want to live together. They were actively trying to find a way to have a more communal retirement. So there wasn't any problem in there being a need and people wanting to live like this. As I said, we did have to go through a fair bit of discussion around sharing. Laundries were a thing. Who cares? I don't care. But I don't like washing, obviously.
Eloise, do you mind if I segue off that? So one of the things we haven't really talked about today at all, which is pertinent to us in Far North Queensland, is remote Indigenous communities, of which there are a lot between Cairns and the top of the Cape and Mount Isa. And I just wanted to add, one of the things that I've often had conversations with remote councillors and mayors in the last 20 years is, can we implement a housing model, whether it's a social housing model, where there are multiple, that's based on family groups, rather than individual 400 square metre lots. And the only community that I know so far that has managed to pull off some planning related to that has been Mapoon, which is the work that Mark Moran did back in early 2000s, where they implemented a larger lot. Actually, James Davidson was involved in that work, if he's around still. That they were based on larger lot sizes that you could put multiple dwellings together for intergenerational housing. And so that's the conversation that's, I guess, been missing from today, is around how this can also be applied in remote areas and where there would be a lot of interest in it as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to bring that into the conversation. I have a question here for James, but I think it also would relate to Sarah. With Nightingale, was there a tipping point in where the numbers would stack up, and a model where it's getting difficult to stack up? And perhaps, Sarah, off the back of that, you could talk a little bit to the Cairns context of stacking up. But maybe I'll start with James, and then Sarah can chime in.
Yeah, well, look, yes, it was easier to stack up 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Much harder to make anything stack up at all now, but that's across buildings generally. Nightingale always aimed to have between 20 and 30 apartments. It was a good sort of community size. We're now pushing that number above that because it's easier to make them work if they're sort of closer to 40 or 50. But we prefer not to, for them not to be that big. It's right now it's a difficult time to ask because it's quite difficult to see how anything stacks up across, unless it's subsidised in some way, just because of construction costs the way they are, and interest rates where they are. So I think, that's what one to sort of wait and see about. But one of the things, I should say what we're looking at doing is looking at potentially having community housing providers who might get funding, and then Nightingale might still do this. I mean, one of the things we don't like at Nightingale is that we're forced to sell for more than we would like to be selling them for, and that's still at cost. So we're now looking at other models that we can get into, such as essentially affordable build-to-rent with community housing providers. So we're examining some of those sorts of things as well.
Yeah, I mean, Cairns actually is in an absolute housing crisis because it is actually not at all financially viable at the moment to get anything more than almost a single house built. Cairns property market, I've always described it as being quite bipolar. So we've been here for 20 years, and post the GFC, which was back in 2008, it flatlined. So the property market actually crashed by 30%, and then it just sort of went very slowly up. It was only after COVID that we jumped 45%. And that's when it was an interesting figure that you put on the board before, that our median house price is now $650. And when I came here, you could buy anything for around $300 to $400, and it didn't change much for like 15 years. So this is the first time we've really seen a city not being affordable for the people here. The median salary in this town is still a lot lower than the average down in the capital city, so that's always been a challenge. Straight after COVID, then obviously construction's gone up. That's gone up all over Australia. We've literally run out of land. So the first homeowners stimulus from the federal government, the government always thinks they're doing great things for the property market. It causes crisis afterwards because then all our land went. And now it's, double to triple to create land. We do have to start going into Bluefield. We've got to go into medium density, high density, but it doesn't work here. It's even more expensive to do high density in Cairns because you've got to get all the materials from Brisbane. I do think technology will start to see changes. We are going to see changes in construction, in modular. I don't know what that's looking like right now, but there's lots of things going on in Vietnam and up in Southeast Asia, and I know there's a lot of Australian companies over there at the moment researching that. That could be a game changer. But yeah, we are as challenged as Melbourne is, and then we have our own really significant environmental issues with flooding and how we manage water, and I mean we're sitting in a floodplain, so everything in Cairns is a challenge to build on. Yep,
challenges and few opportunities that we've seen today too. Absolutely, no, but it is, and I think, and we can't really sugarcoat it in that ways. But it's been, I think, a really refreshing conversation to open up the options for what could be. And we've been doing some work on feasibility testing within to look at our planning scheme against feasibility in the central Cairns area, and looking at when the dial does start to change, what are the things we can do. And I think today's been a really great discussion on the possibilities and opening up the possibilities. I'm really conscious of time. I could sit here and talk all day about this. We pretty much have, but could for days. I just really want to say thank you for you all being here today, and the support from Council for putting this on, and our incredible Kate and Amber for really absolutely championing this day to do, as well as our strat planning team and Sean and Deb and Sophie. It's great to be here. It's great to be joined by these fantastic panellists and speakers. Really appreciate you coming all this way and also lending your local knowledge. Everyone's been very generous. So thank you so much for coming today. It's been a great conversation. I hope we can keep it going.